How's it going? Kevin Cleary with The View from the Pew. I want to talk about something today that's been a pretty hot button issue lately. There's been a recent Supreme Court ruling in the U.S. and our neighbors to the south requiring that all states recognize same-sex marriage. I think people have responded in various ways. I saw my Facebook feed fill up with about half and half. Some people changing, putting a rainbow on their profile picture, and some people, decrying the change and the forced acceptance or the forced recognition for same-sex marriage. Okay, so how do we respond as Christians? What do we do? What do we think? How do we navigate this situation? Okay, first of all, I want you to remember that you are called to follow Jesus as a Christian. And generally speaking, not just about this issue, about a whole laundry list of issues. That's going to call you to be countercultural. That's going to call you to disagree with the vast majority of the population around you, okay? That's normal. And I think sometimes in a North American setting, Christians have, one, not realized that, and two, when it's forced, they've failed to live that principle out in reality. They're so used to living in a world where there's sort of a Judeo-Christian worldview that when all of a sudden that changes and when all of a sudden the world disagrees with them, they totally forget about Jesus' warning from John chapter 16, that in the world you'll have trouble. We all of a sudden when Jesus' warning comes true, we go, whoa, what's happening? How could this be? Well, he told us that would happen. Okay, in John's epistle, the first epistle of John, in chapter 3 and verse 13, John says, don't be surprised when the world hates you. Okay, and so we shouldn't expect, by the way, I love the way John sort of explains that. He goes all the way back to Cain and Abel and says, look, the first person to do the right thing was Abel and his brother killed him for it. So if you're going to do the right thing, don't expect to be patted on the back, expect to be persecuted. That's a more realistic expectation for living a Christian life and doing the right thing, okay? Just expect persecution for that. So that's number one. We're called to follow Jesus, and most of the time that's countercultural. Remember that we're following someone who was crucified for what they taught and believed. And as Jesus himself said, no servant is greater than his master. We should expect a similar response from people. And if by the way, we're getting a positive response all the time, we're probably doing something wrong. Okay? So that's number one. Remember that Christianity and following Jesus most often means being countercultural, most often means holding beliefs and values that the majority of people are going to disagree with. That doesn't mean we have to keep our mouths shut. That doesn't mean we can never express the views that we hold. Just understand that when you do express those views, which you should, you're probably going to get some negative feedback. Okay, that's par for the course. That's number one. Number two, we should embrace and commit to God's standard of human sexuality even more than maybe we have in the past. Okay, to not do so is hypocritical. And we have been guilty of hypocrisy in this regard. Okay? You can't go on Facebook and talk about how terrible the Supreme Court ruling is about same-sex marriage and then use the same computer to view pornography. Okay? That's the height of hypocrisy. And we cannot do that. You can't, come down on your neighbor who identifies as homosexual while saying nothing to the neighbor who has a different guy or a different girl going through their bedroom every single night. Both are wrong in the eyes of God. Okay? You can't make a big issue out of homosexuality and then ignore adultery or divorce or some other aspect of God's standard for human sexuality. All right? It's kind of an all or nothing situation, and we cannot be hypocritical. If we're going to show people what it means to have a healthy approach to sexuality, and I think that's what God wants us to do. It's not that God's against sexuality. It was his idea, okay? But we need to be consistent. So that's number two. We need to be consistent in our application of God's standard for human sexuality. All right? Otherwise, we're being hypocritical. And if you want to go and read Matthew 23, you can see that Jesus doesn't take kindly to that kind of attitude. Okay? We cannot be hypocrites when it comes to this, or anything else for that matter. Okay? The next thing we need to do is understand that sin is sin. First, we need to understand what sin is. Okay? That sin is a violation of the will of God. It means to miss the mark. Okay? Or it means to transgress, to go outside the border. And that's something we need to remember here, because one of the things that you'll hear pertaining to this discussion is an effort to redefine sin. And then once sin has been redefined to something other than what the Bible describes as sin, then the next step is to say, well, see, since this is my new definition of sin, all these things really don't fall into that category. All right, so we need to remember that sin is sin. Any violation of the will of God is sin. Any failure to do the right thing, to live up to the will of God, is also sin. Right? To him who knows the good to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. All right, so sin is to fall short or to transgress. All right, and certainly homosexuality is a violation of God's will. There's no question about that. But so are all kinds of other things, okay? And so we need to remember what sin is, number one. But then, so this is our third point, and I know now I'm breaking this point down a little further. But then we need to remember what God wants to do about sin. Okay? What was God's approach to sin? How did he handle it? Well, he handled it by sending his son, Jesus, to die. All right? That's how God approached sin. Yes, he understands, and we need to understand that sin will separate you from God and send you eternally to hell. But God in no way took pleasure in that. He didn't then, he doesn't now. What he did was send his son to be the sacrifice to make sure so that doesn't have to happen. All right, and we need to look at sin the same way, with love and compassion, understanding that the end of that road is horrible. And we don't want anyone to go down it. All right? And so if you're watching this and maybe you're not a Christian, I would urge you, send me a message, send me an email, go through the YouTube private messaging or here on Facebook where I probably posted this. You need to understand that God doesn't hate you. He's not out to punish you. In fact, he's gone to great lengths to not do that. He's gone to great lengths to give you everything you could ever imagine. Okay? And when we approach as Christians those who are living in some sin, whether it be homosexuality or something else, we have to approach them as God did, willing to sacrifice ourselves to bring them into a right relationship with God. Okay? So that's number 3. Understand what sin is and understand what God has done about it. Take the same approach that he did. We need to treat all people, number 4, as if they're created by God. And as if he cares about each one of them. I've pointed out that there's a big discrepancy here, okay? We have a society that by and large wants to throw out any influence of God. All right? But they're forgetting that it's because of their creator God that they have the very human rights that they're now demanding. All right? It's because we're created by God in his image that we're special, that we're unique above all else that's been created. And even when other people around you don't want to acknowledge that, when they want to act as if there's no God at all, you as a Christian can't do that. You still have to treat them with the dignity and with the respect that their Creator demands. Okay? I know sometimes they want to completely ignore it. But those of us who know better can't do that. Finally, above all these other things, the thing that can make the most difference in the world is to reach out to those people who are lost, to reach out to those people who are living in sin and call them back to the God who loves them. Share the gospel. The best way to change the world is one heart and one mind at a time. And so I need to start with my heart, and you need to start with your heart. And then from there, we can begin to connect with and draw as many people around us as we possibly can into the right relationship with God. In that way, we can make a difference, not just for today. You know, okay, let's imagine for a moment that this great political campaign was begun, and the decision of the Supreme Court was reversed, and now, you know, same-sex marriages were no longer recognized. Okay? And so, in the U.S. or here in Canada or somewhere else, no such thing as same-sex marriage anymore. Great. But if those people who now are not married still go to hell when they die, we haven't really done that much. Okay? The real change, the real thing that people need is forgiveness and life that comes from God and eternity with Him in heaven. And so we ought to spend our time and energy trying to make an eternal difference. I'm not saying we don't do anything in terms of the real physical world we live in. There's a close connection between those two in many cases, but we can't get things out of focus. Okay, we've got to make sure that the changes we're seeking to make in people's lives are primarily eternal changes. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this. That's The View from the Pew.